Can your beliefs change in an instant? Can an unexpected accident reveal truths you never imagined? Zainab Faruqi, a woman living an ordinary life in Lansing, Michigan, had always held firm to her religious values and faith. But one seemingly normal morning turned out to be the biggest turning point in her life. What happened to completely change everything she knew about God, religion, and the afterlife? Join us as Zainab shares her mysterious story, when a near-death experience almost took her life and opened her eyes to a new world she never thought possible. At 47 years old, Zainab Faruqi led an unassuming life in a modest two-story house in Lansing, Michigan, where she had spent most of her adult years. A typical middle-aged woman, she balanced her job as a pharmacy technician at CVS with raising two teenagers, Amira and Zain, alongside her husband, Kareem. Deeply rooted in her faith, Zainab grew up in a devout Muslim family, where religion was the cornerstone of her life. She prayed 5 times a day, fasted during Ramadan, and tried her best to follow the teachings passed down through generations. Her parents, who had immigrated from Pakistan, ensured that the religious traditions of their homeland thrived in their new life in America. That winter morning, like any other, began with the familiar rush of preparing for her early shift. Zainab hurried through the kitchen, making breakfast for the kids before school, with the news quietly playing in the background, warning of an impending snowstorm. She thought to herself about stocking up on groceries later that day. But unbeknownst to her, the carbon monoxide detector in the house had been malfunctioning for weeks. The batteries were dead, and neither she nor Kareem had noticed. Her aging furnace had developed a crack in the heat exchanger, slowly leaking the deadly odorless gas into their home. As she packed lunches, Zainab started feeling dizzy, but dismissed it as mere exhaustion. At the same time, her daughter Amira complained of a headache and wanted to skip school. Zain was upstairs in the shower, and Kareem had already left for work. Zainab's dizziness worsened as she loaded the dishwasher. The room began to spin, and her vision blurred around the edges. Reaching for her phone to call 911, her fingers felt numb and unsteady. The last thing she saw before collapsing was Amira's terrified face. Despite feeling sick herself, Amira managed to call for help. The firefighters arrived just in time, discovering dangerous levels of carbon monoxide throughout the house. Zainab was unconscious. Amira could barely stand, and Zain had passed out in the shower. The paramedics later informed her that her heart had stopped. For 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Zainab was clinically dead. But what happened during those minutes shattered everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the afterlife. Looking back now, she sees how her entire life had led to that moment. Her years of devotion, her unquestioned faith, and her certainty about what awaited her after death. None of it had prepared her for the experience that would unfold. The doctor later said she was incredibly lucky. If Amira hadn't made that call when she did, if the first responders had arrived even a few minutes later, or if the carbon monoxide levels had been slightly higher, none of them would have survived. But now, Zainab knows that luck had nothing to do with it. What happened next was a divine appointment, a moment meant to reveal truths she never expected. For most of her life, Zainab had measured her worth by how well she followed the rules. Did she pray at the right times? Did she dress modestly? Was she a good example of a faithful Muslim woman to her children? These questions shaped her every decision. Her relationship with Kareem was built on this shared understanding. They met at the local Islamic center and raised their children with the same values, attending weekend Islamic school and adhering to their beliefs. Working at CVS sometimes tested her faith. She often had to handle prescriptions that went against Islamic teachings or serve customers whose lifestyles contradicted everything she believed. But Zainab always reminded herself that it wasn't her place to judge. Only Allah could do that. That morning, however, she felt particularly blessed. Amira had just been accepted to Michigan State University with a full scholarship. Zayn's grades were improving, and Kareem had recently received a promotion. Everything seemed to be falling into place for their family, as it should for those who followed the right path. But by the time the sun set that day, Zainab's world would be irreversibly changed. The certainty she'd built her life around would crumble. What she would experience during those few minutes of clinical death wasn't just a change. It was like being reborn with new eyes, seeing the world as it truly is. The truth Zainab uncovered would alter her life and the lives of everyone around her. As she went through her routine that morning, Zainab had no idea that everything she believed about life, death, and God was about to be shattered. When her heart stopped, it wasn't the tunnel of light so often described in near-death experiences. Instead, it was like being plunged into ice-cold water, a jolt that shook her to the core. She found herself floating above her body, watching the paramedics work frantically, their voices muffled as they tried to revive her. She could see herself, lifeless and pale, but strangely detached, as though watching someone else. The details were vivid. One of the paramedics had a coffee stain on his sleeve, and the ceiling of the ambulance had a crack that looked like a question mark. Then everything went dark. It wasn't the typical darkness one experiences when closing their eyes, but a heavy, almost tangible darkness that felt alive. She was being pulled deeper into it, drawn by an invisible force. And then, suddenly, she wasn't alone. A presence, beautiful and terrifying, appeared. It wasn't an angel with gentle wings and a halo, but something far more powerful, ancient, and awe-inspiring. Zainab knew this presence was an angel. The angel didn't speak in words. Instead, images and profound understanding flooded her mind, revealing truths she could never have imagined. In that moment, Zainab saw her entire life unfold before her eyes. Not just the actions she had taken, but the ripple effects of every decision she had made. She saw the time she had been unkind to a coworker, how that moment of frustration had colored her entire day. She saw the elderly woman at the pharmacy whom she had helped with her prescriptions, how that small act of kindness had offered her a glimmer of hope when she needed it most. But what struck Zainab most deeply was seeing the impact of her own religious devotion. She saw people she had encouraged to follow stricter Islamic practices, thinking she was guiding them toward righteousness. Instead, the angel showed her how those well-intentioned efforts had, in fact, pushed them further from the truth. Zainab wanted to protest, to defend her beliefs, but in the presence of this divine being, her arguments felt empty, meaningless. The angel then revealed to her truths about Muhammad, truths she had never known, hidden knowledge that had been distorted or lost over time. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and Zainab saw the world in a way she never could have imagined. As the darkness around them shifted, she began to notice other souls moving through it. Thousands, perhaps millions. Some were drawn upward toward a light she hadn't seen before, while others drifted downward, their spiritual forms dimming as they descended. The angel explained that each soul's destination was not a random fate. It was the natural result of their beliefs and the lives they had led. Zainab watched as Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and people of other faiths discovered the painful truth. Though they had lived sincerely, their beliefs alone had not been enough. The truth had always been available to them, but they had chosen different paths. She saw some souls realizing their mistake too late, crying out to Allah, to their various gods, but their pleas went unanswered. The angel showed her that there was only one way to reach the light, only one truth that could save a soul from descending into the darkness. It was an overwhelming revelation. The angel then guided Zainab closer to the souls that were descending. The anguish they felt was so palpable that it seemed to physically crush her. She saw people she knew, good people, those who had prayed 5 times a day, who had given to charity, and yet they were being pulled downward. Zainab saw Brother Karim, who had led prayers at the mosque for years, and Sister Fatima, who had taught Quran classes to their children. Their faces reflected the same horrifying realization. All their devotion had been misplaced. Their prayers to Allah were futile in the void. But then, the angel showed her something that brought both comfort and sorrow. Zainab saw the children, those who had passed away before reaching adulthood, including children from her own community. Unlike the adults, they were being drawn upward toward the light. The angel helped Zainab understand that these children were innocent, not yet fully immersed in false beliefs. This mercy soothed her heart, but also deepened her sorrow, knowing that so many parents would never see their children again. As they moved through this spiritual realm, Zainab noticed something strange. Some souls were wearing chains made of light. These were not physical chains, but chains of beliefs, traditions, and practices that had bound them during their lives. She saw her own chains, glowing with Arabic calligraphy and Islamic symbols. They were beautiful, but heavy, pulling her downward. The angel then led her to what seemed like a vast courtroom, but it was a courtroom of pure light. Souls were appearing before a judge, but the judge's presence was so bright, so holy, that Zainab could not look directly at it. Each soul's life was examined, not just their actions, but what they had chosen to believe when the truth had been available to them. Zainab watched as a woman from her mosque was shown all the times she had encountered Christian missionaries, all the times she had seen churches or heard the gospel, but had dismissed them. Each instance felt like a witness against her. The truth had been there, but she had refused to see it. And then it was Zainab's turn to face judgment. Every time she had proudly declared the Shahada, every time she had taught her children that Jesus was just a prophet, every time she had dismissed the Bible as corrupted, everything was laid bare before her. The weight of her error felt crushing. But unlike many others, Zainab's judgment wasn't final. She was shown all of this for a reason. The angel communicated that she would be given a chance to return, to share the truth she had learned. But first, she needed to see more. The angel guided her upward toward the light, and as they moved, Zainab felt her chains of false belief begin to dissolve. The light grew stronger and brighter, but it wasn't harsh or blinding. Instead, it felt like being bathed in pure love, a love so powerful it filled every part of her being. As they ascended, Zainab saw different realms or levels, each one more beautiful than the last. But the angel made it clear that these weren't the multiple heavens she had been taught about in Islam. Then she saw him, Jesus Christ, but not as she had known him in Islamic teachings. Not just a prophet, not just a good man, but God himself. His presence was overwhelming, filled with a love so intense that it felt like it might tear her apart. All the lies she had believed about him fell away like autumn leaves in a strong wind, leaving only the purest truth. Zainab's understanding of the Trinity unfolded before her, shattering everything she had been taught. It wasn't three gods, as she had always believed, but one God in three persons, a divine mystery that suddenly made perfect sense. It was like trying to explain the concept of color to someone who had only ever seen in black and white. She couldn't fully comprehend it until she had experienced it. The angel guided her through the truth of history, revealing events she had never learned in her past. She saw Jesus' death on the cross, a truth that had been denied to her, followed by his resurrection. The early Christian church emerged before her, and she watched as the message spread far and wide across the world. But then came a darker revelation. The angel showed her how other religions, including Islam, had distorted these truths. Zainab was taken aback as she witnessed the true origins of Islamic teachings, how political power and human ambition had shaped the faith she had followed so devoutly. The angel revealed a side of Muhammad that was far different from the perfect prophet she had been taught to revere. This wasn't shown to condemn Islam or Muslims, but to help her understand why so many sincere people had been led astray. The angel explained how Satan had carefully crafted this deception over centuries, using humanity's desire for structure and rules to distract from the one true path to salvation. Next, the angel led Zainab to a vast library, not filled with books, but with people's life stories. She saw not just the lives people had lived, but the lives they could have lived. Alternate versions of her own life appeared before her, paths she could have taken if she had embraced the truth sooner. She saw her children growing up free from the chains of false beliefs. She saw herself and her husband leading others toward real freedom rather than deepening their bondage. The hardest part of this journey came next. Zainab was shown the people she had influenced, the friends she had encouraged to be more devout in Islam, neighbors she had invited to the mosque, and even her own children, whom she had taught to reject Christianity. The angel helped her understand the immense responsibility she now carried. Zainab would not only be accountable for her own choices, but also for the impact she had on others. In the midst of this crushing realization, however, the angel showed her hope. Zainab saw how her near-death experience would influence others, how her testimony would help people break free from the same chains that had bound her for so long. She saw Muslims who would hear her story and begin questioning their beliefs, starting their own journey toward the truth. The light around her grew even brighter as she found herself in what could only be described as the throne room of heaven. The presence of God here was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was more real and intimate than any concept of worship she had known before. This wasn't the distant, impersonal Allah she had prayed to, but a Father who knew her intimately and loved her perfectly. In this sacred space, Zainab witnessed the salvation she had always longed for. Souls were entering heaven, not because of their own good works, but because they had placed their faith in Jesus Christ. She saw how their lives reflected that faith through sacraments and deeds inspired by the Holy Spirit. Salvation was a gift of grace, received through faith, affirmed by the sacraments, and demonstrated by good works. The angel revealed how her own religious devotion, her strict adherence to Islamic law, her ritual prayers, her fasting, had actually been a barrier to the truth. These weren't pathways to God, but attempts to earn what could only be freely given through faith in Jesus Christ and participation in his sacraments. Zainab was allowed to witness conversations in heaven, souls, some of whom had been Muslims, others from different faiths, meeting Jesus face to face. What struck her was how many of them said, "But I was so sure I was right." The love they encountered was overwhelming, but for many, it was too late. The angel then showed her something that shattered her heart. She saw millions of Muslims praying earnestly, their prayers hitting a ceiling of brass. Not because God didn't hear them, but because they were praying to a false conception of God. Satan had used their sincerity against them, keeping them satisfied with religious performance while they missed the true salvation that comes through faith in Jesus Christ and living out that faith in sacramental life and good works. Zainab's journey didn't stop there. The angel showed her what would happen if she chose to return to life. She saw the rejection she would face from her Muslim community, the struggles within her family, and the accusations of betrayal and mental illness. But she also saw the lives that would be transformed by her testimony. She knew what she had to do. And then, the moment of decision came. She was given a choice: to remain in heaven or return to share what she had learned. The peace and comfort of heaven were overwhelming, and part of her wanted to stay. But when she saw the lives that would be changed by her story, including her own family, she knew she had a mission to complete on earth. The angel gave her one final vision. She saw her own judgment day, but this time it was from the perspective of having fulfilled her mission on earth. She saw herself standing before Jesus, not as a judge, but as her Savior. She heard the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." The joy of that moment far outweighed any temporary suffering she would face on earth. Zainab returned to her body with a violent jolt, as if being squeezed through a tiny tube. The sharp pain of CPR and the blinding hospital lights overwhelmed her senses. But when her eyes opened, the first face she saw was Kareem's, tears streaming down his face as he held her hand. Their children were there too, their faces swollen with grief. The doctors told her she was lucky to have survived, but Zainab knew it was no mere coincidence. It was God's will. She tried to share her experience with her family, but Kareem believed it was the result of oxygen deprivation. Amira and Zain exchanged worried glances. Nobody wanted to believe that their devout Muslim wife and mother was saying these things. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Zainab's life. Word spread quickly through the Muslim community, and friends who had known her for decades turned away. The imam suggested she needed psychiatric help, and even her own parents called, pleading with her to take back what she had said. But Zainab's faith never wavered. Slowly, people began reaching out to her privately. Other Muslims with doubts who had their own questions. Her daughter, Amira, started to listen, asking about her experiences and her newfound faith. 6 months later, Zainab was invited to speak at a small church. Though terrified, she shared her testimony, and something remarkable happened. The words flowed effortlessly, and people were moved to tears. 3 people accepted Christ that day, choosing to be baptized and commit to lives of service inspired by their faith. Now, 2 years later, Zainab's home has become a sanctuary for seekers. Former Muslims, skeptics, and people who have had their own supernatural experiences. Karim still hasn't fully accepted her new faith, but he's softened. And one night, Zainab caught him reading the Gospel of John, something he thought she hadn't seen. The death threats have mostly stopped, but the occasional hateful message still comes through. But none of it matters to Zainab anymore. She's seen the truth of eternity, and nothing in this temporary life can scare her now. The greatest joy of all came just 3 months ago when Amira confessed she had been praying to Jesus in secret, having experienced God's love while reading the Bible. Zainab's heart swelled with gratitude as she thanked God for giving her a second chance, for allowing her to share the truth and help others find their way. If even one soul is saved through her testimony, Zainab knows it will all have been worth it. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know whose life might be changed forever. Thank you for your listening.